The smell of coffee woke me before I remembered where I was. Not the coffee I used to make. Too strong, too bitter, the kind Julian always complained about. This was lighter, cleaner, the smell that belonged to a morning I recognized, though I hadn't lived it in what felt like years. I lay still, eyes closed. The ceiling of our bedroom had a hairline crack near the left corner. I knew that before I opened my eyes and confirmed it. Our bedroom, past tense and present tense colliding in the dark behind my eyelids. I was 32 years old, and I had died at 34 on a highway in November with the radio off because I hadn't been able to stand music for months. But I was here. March. 2 years earlier. The morning of the day Julian would come downstairs with an envelope, set it on the kitchen counter beside my coffee cup, and tell me the lawyer said it was cleaner this way. I pressed both palms flat against the mattress. Ada was asleep down the hall. I could hear the particular quiet that only exists in a house with a sleeping 4-year-old, a held breath kind of silence, as though the walls themselves were listening for her. I had 14 months in my first life from this morning to the day the judge read the custody order. I had used 10 of those months being devastated and 4 of them being strategic, and in the wrong order. This time, I would not make that mistake. I got up before Julian came downstairs. I showered, dressed, made the coffee. I let the familiar routines carry me, while the other part of my mind, the part that had lived 2 years past this morning, began to build. When Julian came into the kitchen at 7:43, and he was already wearing his work clothes, he set the envelope on the counter. He didn't meet my eyes. "I think you should read that when you have time," he said. "I will," I said. He poured himself coffee, his back to me. The kitchen smelled of the rain that had come in through the window I'd left cracked open overnight. He closed it without acknowledging it. "Ada's still sleeping," I said. "She had a late night." "I know." He left for work at 8:02. I watched his car back down the drive from the kitchen window, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not grief exactly, but the closing of a door I had spent 2 years trying to hold open. I picked up the envelope, didn't open it immediately, just held the weight of it. In my first life, I had opened it standing right here, and the shock had been physical, only like a step missing at the bottom of a staircase. I had called my mother. I had cried so hard Ada had woken up frightened, and I had spent the next hour on the kitchen floor trying to compose myself while a 4-year-old patted my back. That version of the morning was not going to happen again. I set the envelope in my bag. I would read it with a lawyer present. Ada woke at 8:45, padding into the kitchen with her hair flattened on one side and her stuffed rabbit, the one she called Fig, tucked under her arm. She climbed onto the breakfast bar stool and regarded me with the particular seriousness that 4-year-olds deploy before they have said good morning. "Is Daddy gone?" she asked. "He went to work, sweetheart." She accepted this the way she accepted most things, with a brief assessment and then a pivot. "Oh, can I have the toast with the seeds?" "Of course." I made her toast. I poured her the small glass of orange juice she preferred. I watched her eat with the focused attention of someone who is learning, again, that ordinary mornings are not guaranteed. I had 10 days before Julian's lawyer would call mine. I had known that from my first life. 10 days in which Julian would expect me to be in crisis, calling him, crying, negotiating from panic. In my first life, that was exactly what I had done. This morning I called Aldercroft Family Law and made an appointment for 11 o'clock. The lawyer who had represented me in my first life had been fine. Competent, overworked, and under-resourced. She had done what she could with what I gave her, which was very little. I had not understood the first time that my job in a custody case was not to prove I was a good mother. My job was to create a record. Aldercroft had a different reputation. Their custody practice was led by a woman named Margaret, who had been recommended to me in my first life only after the judgment had come down. Someone at the community center had mentioned her name while I was sitting in a parenting class I'd been ordered to take as a condition of my access arrangement. I would not be sitting in that class this time. I dropped Ada at preschool, the same blue-painted building on Ferris Street, the same teacher who crouched down to Ada's level and took her hand, and I drove to Aldercroft. Margaret was small, silver-haired, and had the particular stillness of someone who has heard every version of every story and is waiting for the one thing that will actually matter. She let me speak for 12 minutes before she held up a hand. "Stop there," she said. "Is there a formal agreement in place for the child currently?" "No, we've been separated informally for 3 weeks." "Does he have legal counsel?" "The envelope he gave me this morning is from Pendleton and Associates." Something shifted in her expression. Pendleton represents the Wyndham Group, among other clients. Julian is a senior architect at Wyndham. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. They will file for primary residency. They'll also file a relocation restriction. He'll want to keep you in the city. I know. She looked at me carefully, not with suspicion, with the kind of attention that good lawyers deploy when a client says something that requires recalibration. "Most people in your position don't know that," she said. I've done research," I said. "I'm a pediatric speech therapist. I understand documentation. I want to know exactly what a family court evaluator will be looking for, because I intend to give it to them." She leaned back slightly. "Tell me what you know about the other party." I told her. I told her about Arabella, Julian's colleague at Wyndham, whom I had found out about through a forwarded email in my first life, and whom I had since confirmed through other means. I told her about the apartment Julian had been renting since February, which I knew because I had seen the bank statement. I told her about Ada's schedule, her speech therapy appointments. She had a mild articulation delay, not a clinical referral yet, but I had already booked a formal session with my colleague Gideon as a precaution, her preschool, her routines. Margaret took notes without looking up. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "Primary residence," I said. "I will agree to generous parenting time for Julian. I'm not trying to remove him from her life, but I want the record to show that I am the consistent parent, and I want it to show that before the evaluator is assigned." "That's a long game." "I know. I'm prepared for it." She looked at me for another moment. "I'll file a response to Pendleton on Monday. In the meantime, I want you to begin a contemporaneous record. Dated entries, every interaction regarding the child, every exchange, every pickup and drop-off. Text messages saved, emails printed. Don't delete anything. Don't respond emotionally in writing." "I understand. One more thing," she said. If he proposes supervised visitation for you in the interim, and with Pendleton involved, he may consider agreeing." "I was going to suggest that myself," I said. She paused again, this time with something closer to interest. "Most mothers refuse on principle," she said. "I know, but agreeing to supervision accomplishes 3 things. It signals to the court that I'm not threatened by oversight. It gives me a neutral observer who can document my parenting, and it forces him to use an official supervisor, which means there will be records for his time too, eventually." Margaret said nothing for a moment, then she closed her notepad. "You've thought about this carefully." "I've had time," I said. That was true, in every way it could be true. I drove to pick up Ada at noon. The preschool parking lot had a particular smell in March. Wet pavement, and somewhere underneath it, the first thin note of something green. Ada came running out with a paper crown on her head, gold painted, the points already bending. She had made it for no occasion in particular. She just wanted a crown. "Can I keep wearing it?" she asked, already climbing into her car seat. "Until it falls apart," I said. I drove home with the paper crown catching light in the rearview mirror and thought about the 14 months I had lived, once, that I was about to live differently. The documentation system I built over the next week was not complicated. Complexity was the enemy of consistency, and consistency was the only thing that mattered. I bought a dedicated notebook, not a phone app, because paper cannot be hacked or accidentally deleted or dismissed in court as potentially edited. I dated every entry at the top with the time and weather, habits that sound redundant until they are the thing that establishes credibility. Every pickup, every drop-off, time, location, Ada's stated mood, any notable behavior, what she had eaten if I knew it, any physical observations relevant to her well-being. Every text from Julian, printed and filed in a folder labeled by date, every voicemail, transcribed in the notebook with a timestamp, and the notation recording retained. I also began a second file, which I thought of privately as the architecture of what was coming. I knew Julian's patterns. I knew where he cut corners as a parent, which not out of cruelty, but out of inattention. The kind of inattention that looked like normalcy until it was held against a standard of care. He forgot sunscreen in summer. He let Ada sleep in her day clothes when he was tired. He fed her from whatever was convenient, which was usually fine, but occasionally consisted of crackers and a handful of grapes for dinner because Arabella was coming over and he was distracted. He did not understand Ada's articulation therapy exercises and had told me, in my first life, that he thought I was making too much of it. I did not know in this life whether Julian loved Ada in the way that mattered at the level of daily practice. I had decided to stop asking that question. What I knew was that he loved the idea of being Ada's primary parent more than he understood what that responsibility required. Oh, Julian's lawyer sent the formal filing on Monday, as expected. He was proposing that I take supervised visitation pending a custody evaluation. The supervisor would be from a court-approved agency. His proposed schedule for his own time was generous by paperwork. Every other weekend, it read, and would have looked absurd to anyone who knew that Julian traveled for work at least twice a month, and had been doing so for the 3 years Ada had been old enough to have preferences. Margaret called me that afternoon. He's aggressive in the initial filing. That's a signal. Of what? That Pendleton has told him to establish dominance early, set the tone, expect you to counterfile something emotional, and give them material. I won't. No, she said. You'll agree to the supervised visitation, and you'll write a cooperative response that lists your proposed supervisor from the approved list and suggests a parallel home study for both parties. Parallel home study wasn't in his filing. It wasn't, which is exactly why you're going to propose it. I signed the response on Wednesday. On Thursday, Julian's assistant called to coordinate the first supervised visit. Her name was Dana. Young, efficient, clearly uncomfortable with the assignment. Mr. Wyndham asked me to coordinate directly with you, she said. He thought it would be less formal. That's fine, I said. Please confirm the name and credentials of the supervising contact from the agency. A pause. I'll need to get that for you. Of course, I'll need it before I confirm the appointment. She called back in 40 minutes with the name. I wrote it down and, that evening, looked up the supervisor's professional profile, reviewed her agency's reporting practices, and confirmed that their case notes were admissible in family court proceedings. They were. The first supervised visit took place on a Saturday in late March at a contact center on the ground floor of a building downtown. The room had low couches and a basket of toys and a window with a view of a parking structure. It smelled like carpet cleaner, and faintly, of the coffee the supervisor had left in a paper cup on the desk by the door. Ada wore her yellow coat. She held Fig under one arm with the particular grip she used when she was uncertain of a space. The supervisor, a woman in her 40s named Grace, sat at a slight remove and took notes that I could not read from where I sat. I did not perform anything for Grace's benefit. That was the first thing Margaret had told me. Do not perform. Performing for an evaluator reads as performing. Interact with your child exactly as you always do. The observer should disappear into the room. Ada and I built a tower from foam blocks and knocked it over 4 times. She narrated the collapse of each tower in different voices. The third one was a ghost, which she announced gravely before sweeping it with both arms. I asked her about her week, her friends at preschool, what she had named the spider she had been tracking in the garden before the rains came. I called him Stanley, she said, but I think he moved. Spiders move around a lot, I said. They're always looking for better spots. Do you think he found one? I do. The session was 90 minutes. At the end of it, Ada hugged me with the full body compression that is particular to small children. Both arms, both legs, chin tucked into the shoulder. I held her for as long as she held me and let go when she released first. I did not look at Grace. Outside in the parking structure, in my car, I opened my notebook and wrote the date, time, Ada's initial state, her engagement during the session, her affect at departure, and a brief factual account of our activities. I noted that she had presented with mild guardedness on arrival and had relaxed within 15 minutes. I noted Grace's full name and agency, the session's start and end time, and the fact that I had departed the facility at the same time as Ada and the supervisor, with Ada transferred to Julian's care at 2:15 p.m. Julian had been in the waiting area. He had nodded at me. And I had nodded back. This, too, I noted. The supervised visits became every Saturday for the first month, then moved to alternating Saturdays as the evaluation process began. I never missed one. I never arrived late. I brought Ada's preferred snacks. Not to show off, but because she had a texture sensitivity around crackers with seeds, and the contact center's snack tray reliably included them. I had documented this sensitivity with Gideon, who had cross-referred me to an occupational therapist. The OT's formal report, documenting Ada's sensory profile and the accommodation strategies I had implemented at home, went into my file. On the 4th supervised visit, Ada told me that Arabella had stayed at the house on the weekend. She did not say this as a disclosure. So she said it the way 4-year-olds say everything, as a loose piece of information that wanted somewhere to go. Arabella has a dog, she said. A small one. It slept in my room. Did you like that? I asked. It licked my ear, she said, which was not an answer, but a 4-year-old's version of one. I wrote it in my notebook that evening. Date, time, Ada's exact words, context of the statement, no interpretation, no editorializing, just the record. Margaret had been clear on this. The temptation to interpret was the thing that destroyed documentation. Facts were credible. Conclusions drawn from facts were arguable. I was building a record, not a case theory. 3 weeks later, I also noted, in a separate entry, that when I had dropped Ada at Julian's on a Thursday evening, Arabella's car had been in the driveway. I photographed the license plate from the street. I did not do anything with the photograph yet. I just kept it. Julian called me in April, not through his lawyer, which was itself a data point. He was cheerful in the particular way he became cheerful when he wanted something. "I think this process is going well," he said. "I wanted to talk about transitioning to unsupervised time. I'll have my lawyer draft something." "Let the evaluation proceed," I said. "It's almost halfway done. It would look strange to interrupt it now." A pause. "It's just a lot of structure for Ada." "She's adjusting beautifully," I said. "Grace's notes reflect that." Another pause. He hadn't expected me to know what Grace's notes reflected. "We should keep things civil," he said. "We are keeping things civil," I said. That I hung up and wrote the date and time and a summary of the conversation. The guardian ad litem was assigned in May. Her name was Josephine, and she had been practicing family law in this city for 18 years, which I knew because I had looked her up after hearing her name in my first life and thinking, briefly, that I should have known more about her before she wrote her report. In my first life, Josephine had met me twice, once for an intake interview at which I had been defensive and unprepared, and once for a home visit at which I had been overprepared in all the wrong ways, staged, nervous, the apartment too clean in the way that reads as performance. I had learned, in the years since, that Josephine was specifically trained to identify the difference between a parent who was consistent and a parent who was attempting to manage an impression. She had written about it in a paper that I had found during the worst year of my first life, while trying to understand the recommendation that had changed everything. I did not intend to manage an impression. I intended to have nothing to manage. Josephine called on a Tuesday morning while I was between client sessions at the clinic. I was working part-time. I had increased my hours in the first month after Julian served the papers, a little partly for financial reasons, and partly because Margaret had advised that employment stability was a factor. And I had a 20-minute gap between an 8-year-old with expressive language delays and a 6-year-old whose family had recently relocated. "Dr. Mara," Josephine said, "I've been assigned to Ada's case. I'd like to schedule our initial meeting at your home, if possible, so I can see her environment." "Of course," I said. "I can do this Saturday morning, or any weekday afternoon before 3. Saturday at 10 would suit me. I'll confirm the address by text." I did not tell Josephine that I knew her paper or her reputation. And I treated her the way I treated every assessor in this process, with complete transparency about the things that were true and complete discipline about the things that needed to be shown rather than explained. The apartment was not staged on Saturday morning. The kitchen had the dishes from Ada's breakfast still on the counter, rinsed but not put away. Ada's drawings were on the fridge, 7 of them, in varying levels of competence, all labeled by me in pencil in the corner with Ada's stated subject and the date she made them. The living room had Fig on the couch and a puzzle half completed on the coffee table. Ada was at her best on Saturday mornings. She had slept well, she had eaten, and she was in the middle of a sustained interest in birds. which meant she had been narrating the sparrows outside the window for 20 minutes by the time Josephine arrived. "That one's the same one," Ada told Josephine, without preamble, pointing at the window. "He has a bent toe." Josephine looked at the window. "How do you know it's bent?" "I saw it when he landed on the ledge. Mama has a picture." Josephine looked at me. "She asked me to photograph the sparrow," I said, "so we could compare visits." "I'm making a chart," Ada said, "of the times he comes. Mama helps me write the numbers." This was true. We had been doing it for 3 weeks. It had started because Ada asked why the sparrow kept coming back to the same spot, and I had told her we could find out by tracking when he appeared. We made a small paper chart, Ada's handwriting, me my guidance, and she had been filling it in diligently every time she spotted what she was increasingly certain was the same bird. Josephine sat with Ada for 40 minutes while I made tea in the kitchen and kept the door open so I could hear without intervening unless asked. Then Josephine sat with me for another 40 minutes while Ada completed her puzzle in the living room. "How do you manage the separation anxiety?" Josephine asked. This was her clinical voice, neutral, open-ended. "She doesn't have clinical separation anxiety," I said. "She's adjusting to a changed routine. Those are different things. I see it in my own practice." "What do you do when she's distressed after a transition?" "I give her space and time to regulate. Then I name what I'm noticing. Then I ask if she wants to talk about it. Usually she doesn't. Or right away. Usually she circles back to it later, on her own terms." "Do you document those conversations?" "I document anything that seems relevant to her emotional well-being, yes. I keep a log." "May I see it?" I handed her the notebook. She read for several minutes. She turned each page carefully, and I watched her face for the thing I had seen in my first life when a different evaluator had looked at a notebook that had only been started the week before they asked for it. A very small contraction around the eyes, a recalibration. Josephine's expression did not contract. She read the full thing, from the first entry. "These go back to March," she said. "March 12th, I said. "The morning my husband delivered the initial filing." She looked at me. That was the first day?" "I wanted to have a record from the beginning." She handed the notebook back. "I'll be scheduling a home visit at your husband's residence as well," she said. "Standard practice." "Of course. And I'd like to observe a transition pickup if that can be arranged through the agency." "I'll let Grace know." She left at noon. Ada watched the sparrow for a few minutes after she went, then turned to me with the expression that meant she was processing something. "She asked a lot of questions," Ada said. "She did. That's her job." "Like your job asking kids questions?" "A little bit like that, yes." Ada seemed to find this satisfying. She went back to her puzzle. I sat on the couch and held my coffee cup. It was cold, I hadn't touched it, and did not let myself feel anything particular yet. Julian's home visit was the following week, on a Thursday. I knew it had happened because Josephine sent a brief administrative email confirming it had been completed. I knew what she would have found because I knew what Julian's house contained. In my first life, I had been surprised by Julian's home visit report, surprised by the details Josephine had noted, and even more surprised by the ones she hadn't. She had noted, in my first life's report, a child's bedroom that was decorated but infrequently used, based on the observation that the art materials were still in their original packaging, and the books on the shelf had not been opened recently. A detail she derived from the fact that several were shelved spine inward, the way books get placed by someone who is arranging rather than reading. She had noted that the kitchen did not have Ada's preferred foods, based on the absence of the allergen-aware snack products listed in Ada's occupational therapy assessment. She had noted that when she asked Julian to describe Ada's bedtime routine, he described it as approximately 45 minutes, which did not align with Ada's stated preference for a routine that included 3 books and a specific song. None of that had saved me in my first life, because I had not known any of it was in the report until after the judgment. This time I knew, and I knew what else Josephine was going to find. Arabella had moved in with Julian in April, 3 months ahead of when she had done so in my first life. An acceleration I attributed to the fact that Julian, reading my cooperation as weakness, felt more secure. He had stopped being careful. Ada had told me about Arabella's dog staying over. Ada had also told me, in her circling, oblique way, that Arabella sometimes took her to preschool in the mornings. Not Julian. Arabella. I noted this in my notebook. I also noted the specific morning, the Tuesday after a custodial weekend, when Ada came back with a small red mark on her forearm. Ada said the dog had nipped her. She said it didn't hurt. She said it was an accident. I photographed the mark. I noted the date and time. I took Ada to her pediatrician that afternoon for a routine appointment that happened to fall on the same day, and I mentioned the mark to the doctor in the context of the appointment. The doctor documented it, not as anything serious, because it wasn't, but as a notation in Ada's record. There were now 3 records of that incident: my notebook, the photograph on my phone time-stamped to Tuesday afternoon, and the pediatrician's note. I did not call Julian about it. I did not send an angry text. I noted it and moved on. Margaret, when I told her, was quiet for a moment. "You didn't react," she said. "There was nothing to react to that wasn't already documented." "Most parents would have reacted." "I know," I said. "And that reaction, in writing, would have looked like conflict instigation." She made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement. "I'm going to request a formal accounting of who is present during Julian's custodial time. His filing described a household of 2 adults and 1 child." It did. The household is now 3 adults, 1 child, and a dog. "A dog with a history of nipping," I said. "I'll note that we're not alleging anything. So we're requesting current household documentation." "Of course," I said. Julian's response to the documentation request was interesting. He filed an updated household description that listed Arabella as a cohabitant and described the dog as a small, well-tempered companion animal. He also took the opportunity, in the same filing, to suggest that my request indicated a pattern of monitoring and control that was concerning in a co-parenting context. Margaret read this to me over the phone with the particular dryness of someone who has been doing this for 30 years. "He's trying to reframe documentation as surveillance," she said. "I know. Is it working?" "It's a standard move. Josephine will have seen it approximately 600 times. She paused. "Have you been careful about your communication logs?" "Oh, nothing that could be read as monitoring. Everything I have documented is either information Ada gave me voluntarily or observations made during court-supervised contact." "Good. Then his filing has given us a formal record of Arabella's presence in the home, which we didn't have before. The psychological evaluation took place in June, in the office of a clinician named Dr. Silvano, who had been appointed by the court. His office was on the 4th floor of a building near the Civic Center. The elevator had a particular sound, a low metallic sigh at each floor that I remembered from my first life because I had ridden it 3 times and cried in the stairwell on the way out. I sat across from Dr. Silvano and answered every question with the same quality of attention I brought to my clinical work. He asked about my childhood. I told him the truth, which was unremarkable. He asked about my marriage. I described it factually, without embellishment and without self-pity. He asked about my mental health history, and I told him about the 6 months of depression I had experienced after Ada's birth, for which I had sought treatment, for which I had documentation, and which had been fully resolved. In my first life, I had volunteered this information at the end of the session, as an afterthought, as though I were confessing. Dr. Silvano had noted in his report that the disclosure came late and lacked context, which contributed to an impression of evasiveness. This time I disclosed it in the second question of the session, in the context of a question about health history. "I experienced a period of postpartum depression following Ada's birth," I said. "That's when I sought treatment through my GP and completed a 12-week cognitive behavioral therapy course. I have the records if they're useful. It resolved fully by the time Ada was 8 months old and has not recurred." Dr. Silvano made a note. "Thank you for that." He asked about my parenting philosophy. I spoke about Ada's sensory profile, her speech development, her emerging interest in tracking and observing, and my approach to using her interests as scaffolding for learning. I described our routines. I described how I handled her distress. I described what I did when I didn't know the answer, because I had learned in my first life that evaluators did not want perfect parents. They wanted honest ones. When she asks me why she has 2 houses now, I said, I tell her it's because her dad and I are figuring out a new kind of family, and that she will always have both of us. Sometimes she accepts that. Sometimes she asks the same question again in a different way, and I give her the same answer until it starts to settle. Does it settle? It's settling, I said. It takes time. Dr. Silvano asked about Julian. I said that I believed Julian loved Ada and that I was committed to facilitating their relationship. I said that I had concerns about some aspects of the care arrangements that I had documented and shared with my legal counsel. I said that I hoped the evaluation process would provide clarity. I did not say he prioritizes his girlfriend over our daughter. I did not say he has no idea what she eats or what she's afraid of. Or else I did not say, in another life, I watched him get primary custody, and I watched Ada come to his house for weekends and call Arabella by a soft name that wasn't quite a name, something she had made up that meant something I couldn't afford to think about. I said, I have concerns. I have documentation. I trust the process to consider them. Dr. Silvano's final note, which I would not read until the composite report in August, described me as a thoughtful and structured parent with strong professional insight into child development, who demonstrated appropriate emotional regulation and transparent self-disclosure throughout the evaluation process. The incident that changed the trajectory of the case took place on a Tuesday night in late June. Ada was with Julian. His custodial time had expanded slightly as part of an interim agreement Margaret and Pendleton had negotiated in May. Julian had 2 evenings per week and every other full weekend, and the supervision requirement had been lifted 2 months prior on the basis of my unblemished supervised visit record and Josephine's interim report, which had described my parenting as consistent, attuned, and child-centered. Julian's expanded time was fine. I had agreed to it partly because it was right for Ada, and partly because I knew from my first life that the expansion would come, and that it would give Julian the rope he needed. At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late June, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered it. It was a nurse at Fossgate Children's Hospital. Old Ada had been brought in 40 minutes earlier with a laceration on her chin requiring 2 sutures. She was stable and asking for me. I was in my car before the nurse had finished speaking. In the emergency department, Ada was on a cot with a small bandage on her chin, fig clamped under both arms, her eyes enormous and dry. She had already finished crying. Julian was in the corner of the room, standing with his hands in his pockets, wearing the expression of someone who had been waiting for something to be over. Arabella was not there. That registered. She fell, Julian said when he saw me, off the playground structure in the back garden. It was around 10:30. She was still up. We were, I'm here now, I said. Not to Julian, to Ada. Ada held out her arms, and I came to her, and the specific quality of a child's grip, when they have been frightened and are no longer frightened, is something that cannot be replicated or adequately described. I stayed for 40 minutes. I spoke to the doctor. I noted in my mind several things. That Ada had been awake at 10:30 on a school night. That the playground structure in Julian's back garden did not have the rubberized surface padding that I had researched and requested in writing in March, and that Julian had replied that it was on the list. That Julian had not called me until after he arrived at the hospital, which meant there was a gap of approximately 30 to 40 minutes between the incident and my notification. I did not make any of these observations aloud. I drove home and I sat at my kitchen table, and I wrote 6 pages in my notebook. I noted the time of the hospital call, the nurse's name, the case number on Ada's discharge paperwork, the doctor's name, the time of Ada's admission as stated by the nurse, the time Julian reported the fall occurring, and the arithmetic of the gap. I noted that when the nurse had reached me, listed as Ada's primary contact in her medical records, which I had confirmed with the practice in March, Julian had already been at the hospital for 40 minutes. I noted that when I asked Ada, gently, in the car on the way home the next morning, whether Arabella had been there when she fell, Ada said, "She went home when I fell because the dog was locked in the car." I noted this verbatim in quotes with the time and context. I sent the notebook pages to Margaret the following morning, photographed and organized. She called me that afternoon. "The dog in the car," she said. "Yes." He wasn't alone with Ada. Arabella was present. The dog was present in a vehicle in what I assume was his drive. The child sustained an injury requiring sutures, which the father did not report to the primary caregiver for approximately 40 minutes. That's what the timeline shows. The unreported 40-minute gap is a violation of the interim parenting plan, she said. Section 4, Paragraph 2. Each party shall notify the other within 30 minutes of any medical incident involving the child. I had known about that clause. I had suggested it through Margaret when the interim plan was drafted. File the violation notice, I said. I'll file it today. I'll also file a formal request for the hospital records, to the paramedic call log if applicable, and a response from Julian explaining the delay. His response, when it came, was that he had been focused on Ada's well-being and that the 30-minute notification window was unrealistic in a genuine emergency. Margaret noted in her counter-filing that the notification had come 47 minutes after admission, not 30, and that the original fall had occurred at least 30 minutes before admission, making the total notification gap well over an hour. She also noted that this was not the first documentation of a care concern during Julian's custodial time, and attached a summary of the prior incidents I had recorded. Josephine, as guardian ad litem, received copies of all filings. She sent a brief acknowledgement, noting that she would consider the material in her ongoing assessment. I heard nothing more from Josephine directly until July, when she called to schedule a second interview with Ada. Ada, by this point, had started to find the various interviews and assessments unremarkable. She had the adaptability of children who are loved consistently. She adjusted to new contexts without losing her footing, because her footing was always the same. I dropped her at Josephine's office on a Wednesday afternoon. Josephine conducted the interview alone. I waited in the corridor. The corridor had a water cooler that made a soft glugging sound every few minutes. I sat and listened to it, and did not try to imagine what was being said inside. When Ada came out 40 minutes later, she was carrying a small sticker of a sparrow that Josephine had given her. Ada regarded it solemnly. She had pictures of birds on her shelf, Ada told me. I told her about Stanley. What did she say? She said she hoped he found a good spot. We went home. I made dinner. Ada stuck the sparrow sticker to the corner of her bird chart. Margaret called on a Friday in late July. Her voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, not excitement exactly, but the particular precision of someone delivering something they have been waiting to deliver. Julian's lawyers filed a motion this morning to expand his custodial time to primary residence, effective immediately, pending final judgment, she said. On what grounds? They're arguing that the evaluation process has been extended unnecessarily, and that Ada's disrupted routine warrants a decisive interim arrangement. I was quiet for a moment. In my first life, this motion had come in the same week as the final evaluation report, and it had been granted temporarily because my own documentation had been thin, my own evaluations incomplete, and the judge had taken the path of least resistance while waiting for the formal custody determination. What's the current status of the report? I said. Dr. Silvano submits next week. Josephine submits the week after. So he filed the motion in the window between Dr. Silvano's submission and Josephine's. Yes, he's trying to establish primary care as a fait accompli before Josephine's recommendation. That's my reading, yes. Counterfile, I said. Use the hospital incident documentation, the notification violation, and Dr. Silvano's interim statement about Ada's current stability. I'll argue that a sudden change of primary residence would disrupt an established routine without evidence of clinical necessity. Margaret was quiet for a beat. I was going to suggest exactly that. I know, I said. The motion was argued the following Tuesday before Judge Leander, who had been assigned to the case in April. In my first life, Judge Leander had been the one who read the final custody order with the particular neutrality of someone who had already composed their expression. I had not known, in my first life, how to read Leander's courtroom demeanor. I had interpreted his neutrality as indifference, and had not understood, until much later, that his approach was consistent regardless of outcome, that he was one of the few family court judges in this city who actually read the evaluation reports in full. He denied the emergency motion. He cited the advanced stage of the evaluation process and the lack of evidence of immediate risk to Ada's well-being. Julian's lawyer used the phrase established pattern of documentation as a litigation strategy in his oral argument. Judge Leander allowed the statement and made no visible response. After the hearing in the corridor, Julian was standing near the elevator with Arabella, who had attended despite not being a party to the proceedings. She was wearing a dark coat and had the controlled expression of someone who had been briefed on how to look. Julian looked at me once. I nodded, and kept walking. Dr. Silvano's report arrived on a Thursday morning, submitted simultaneously to both legal teams and to Josephine's office. I read it that evening, at my kitchen table, with Ada asleep down the hall and Fig on the couch where she'd left him. The report was 14 pages. I read every page. He had evaluated both Julian and me. His assessment of Julian described a father who was emotionally invested in a positive outcome, but who demonstrated limited knowledge of the child's developmental and therapeutic needs, and who appeared to view the other parent's engagement with clinical professionals as competitive rather than collaborative. That sentence, that specific sentence. In my first life, I had never seen it. In my first life, Dr. Silvano's report had described Julian in more neutral terms and had noted my postpartum history as a flag requiring further consideration. I had not been given the opportunity to contextualize it. It had sat in the report like a stone. This time, the report noted my postpartum history in the context of a fully resolved episode with documented treatment and no recurrence, and described it as an example of the evaluated parent's proactive approach to mental health, consistent with her professional background and self-awareness. I sat with the report for a long time. Then I put it down, made a cup of tea I didn't drink, and went to check that Ada was still breathing in the particular way that parents do in the dark. Not from worry exactly, but from the need to confirm that certain things are still true. She was asleep on her side, one hand tucked under her chin, Fig at the foot of the bed, where he always ended up by midnight. I went back to the kitchen and sat with the report until the tea was cold. Josephine's report arrived 11 days later, on a Tuesday. It was 22 pages. I read the first page standing up, still in my coat, because I had come home from a client session and picked up the email notification from Margaret before I had taken off my shoes. I sat down on the second page. Josephine had structured her report around Ada. Not around the parents, not around the history of the case, not around the filings and counter-filings that had accumulated over 5 months, around Ada. Her observed behavior, her expressed preferences, noted carefully as the preferences of a 4-year-old, with the appropriate qualification that such preferences cannot be determinative, but must be considered. Her developmental progress, her emotional state as Josephine had observed it over 3 interviews and 2 home visits. She described Ada as a cognitively advanced, emotionally perceptive child who has demonstrated remarkable resilience during a period of significant family transition. She noted that Ada's secure attachment to her primary caregiver was a significant protective factor in her adjustment. She noted that Ada's primary caregiver had been consistent, present, and responsive throughout the evaluation period. She did not name me until the 6th page, and then she named me by my professional title. She described Julian's home as a well-appointed residential environment that does not yet reflect Ada's individual needs and routines. She noted the kitchen observation, the absence of Ada's preferred foods. She noted the books shelved spine inward. She noted the art materials still in their original packaging. She noted that when she had asked Ada what she liked to do at Daddy's house, and Ada had said, "Watch TV sometimes, and the dog is funny, but sometimes I miss my bird chart." The bird chart, that small paper with Ada's handwriting and my guidance, tracking a sparrow that may or may not have had a bent toe. Josephine had noted it during her observation of my home visit. She had cross-referenced it with Ada's statement at Julian's home visit, and she had used it, this single specific detail, as an example of what she described as the primary caregiver's practice of translating the child's interests into structured, interactive learning experiences that reflect attunement to the child's individual cognitive style. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I read the final 3 pages. Josephine's recommendation was clear. She recommended primary residence with me, with defined parenting time for Julian, every other weekend, 1 midweek overnight, and 1 scheduled phone or video call on the alternate days. She recommended a formal review in 12 months, with progress measured against clear benchmarks for Ada's developmental and emotional well-being. She recommended that Julian complete a parenting course specifically focused on child development in the 2 to 6 age range to be completed within 6 months. She recommended that the household dog be assessed by a behavioral specialist before Ada's next overnight at Julian's home, And she noted, in the final paragraph of her recommendations, that the clinical picture supported by Dr. Silvano's evaluation, the documentation records submitted by the primary caregiver's legal counsel, and her own observations were collectively consistent in their findings. Collectively consistent. 3 separate processes, 3 separate observers, 1 record. I put the report down on the kitchen table. I could hear rain starting outside, the kind that comes in sideways and smells like cold earth. I had built this. Not luck, not a savior, not a judge's sympathy or a lawyer's brilliance, though Margaret had been exceptional. I had built it from the first morning. From the moment I opened my eyes in a bedroom I recognized and decided that this time I would not wait for the system to see me clearly. I would give it a record it could not look away from. A contemporaneous journal begun the day of the initial filing. Medical records, OT assessments, speech therapy, progress notes, time-stamped photographs, printed and filed communications. A notification clause placed inside the interim parenting plan that Julian had agreed to without reading carefully, because in his version of this story, the parenting plan was a formality. The pediatric records flagging the dog incident, the hospital timeline, the violation notice. None of it required a private investigator. None of it required confrontation. It required showing up every day and writing down what was true. I thought about my first life's version of this evening. The judgment in my first life had come down in October, not August. And it had gone the other way. I thought about Ada in my first life, learning to call Arabella by that soft sound that wasn't quite a name. I thought about the weekends she came to me, smaller and quieter each time, as though she was being trained to take up less space. But I did not let myself stay in that memory. The final hearing was 3 weeks later, a Thursday morning in August. The courtroom had a particular smell, old wood and the air conditioning that had been running since before any of us arrived. Judge Leander was already at the bench when I entered. Julian sat at the table to my left with his Pendleton lawyers. Arabella was not in the courtroom. I sat at the table to my right with Margaret. The hearing was not long. Both reports had been submitted. The filing record was in evidence. There was no new testimony, only brief oral arguments from both sides. Pendleton argued that Julian was a capable, loving parent who had been subjected to an extended and adversarial documentation process designed to undermine his parental relationship. He asked the court to weigh the reports in the context of what he called an asymmetric litigation approach taken by my legal counsel. Margaret argued that the documentation was not adversarial. It was parenting. She asked Judge Leander to note that the evaluation reports, 3 independent assessments, had reached the same conclusion through different methodologies. Judge Leander asked 2 questions. He asked Julian's lawyer when Julian had last attended one of Ada's speech therapy sessions. Julian's lawyer consulted his notes and said he did not have that information available. He asked me, through Margaret, whether Ada was currently enrolled in any extracurricular or developmental activities. I answered directly. She was in speech therapy with Gideon at the Stonereach Clinic, and she had started a weekly nature observation program at the Ravenswood Community Center, and she had expressed an interest in learning to swim, which I had not yet pursued because the schedule was still in transition. Judge Leander wrote something down. He read the judgment 40 minutes later, after a brief recess in which I sat very still and thought about nothing. Primary residence, with me, effective immediately. Defined parenting time for Julian, as per Josephine's recommendation. Every other weekend. 1 midweek overnight. Scheduled calls, parenting course, mandatory within 6 months. Dog behavioral assessment, mandatory before next overnight. Review hearing, 12 months. I did not exhale loudly. I did not grip Margaret's arm. I sat and listened to the full judgment and noted each point as Judge Leander read it, not the way I would note anything. Carefully, completely, without missing a word. Julian did not look at me when the judgment was read. He was looking at the middle distance between the bench and the door, and his face had the quality of a man who had genuinely not expected this outcome, which told me something I had not let myself examine until this moment. He had believed he would win. He had believed it because in his understanding of the situation, I was the emotional one, the reactive one, the one who could be baited into a mistake that would become evidence. He had spent 5 months waiting for me to lose control, and the waiting had made him careless. He had stopped documenting. He had stopped managing his own record. He had simply waited. That was the mistake. Outside the courthouse, as Margaret walked with me down the steps to the street, the August air was thick and warm, the kind that makes the city feel like a held breath waiting to release. "You should know," Margaret said, "that in 22 years of family law, I have had perhaps 5 clients who came to me already understanding what they were building." "I had time to think," I said. That was all I said. She shook my hand and walked to her car. I drove to Stone Reach to pick up Ada from her Thursday session with Gideon. The clinic's waiting room had the smell of clean plastic and children's art supplies, and Ada came out carrying a worksheet she had completed on phoneme blending, which she was inexplicably proud of despite not knowing what phoneme blending was. "Gideon says I'm doing well," she told me. "You are," I said. Can we check on Stanley when we get home?" "We can." She climbed into her car seat and buckled her own chest clip, a recent development she was very focused on, and held Fig in her lap with the easy grip of a child who was not afraid. I drove. The sparrow was on the ledge when we got home, as he had been 3 times in the last week. Ada pressed her face to the glass to look at his foot, which she insisted was bent, though I had privately concluded the bend was too subtle to confirm from inside. "He's back," she said. "He is. I think this is his spot now." She was satisfied with this. He decided. I stood behind her at the window and looked at the bird on the ledge and thought about a highway in November and headlights and the specific silence that comes before impact. Then I turned to the kitchen to make dinner. Ada needed feeding. Money the chart needed updating. Tomorrow she would go to school and come home with a drawing or a new question or a paper crown, and I would be there to see it. I put the kettle on. She picked up her pencil and made a mark on the chart in the column for Thursday. "Can I put a star next to this one?" she asked. "What's the star for?" She considered this seriously. "Because he came back," she said, "even though he didn't have to." "Yes," I said. "Put a star." She drew it carefully, in the deliberate way she did everything she was proud of, pressing hard enough that it showed through to the page below. I watched her do it. The door was closed. Behind it, a version of this story in which I had lost time, lost the record, lost the morning I should have started with, was finished. This one was not.
It's not hateful. The intention is separate from the reception. Pet strength for breeze. Does that work just for the air? Okay, so I have this photo that I took in Joshua Tree, and I kind of feel like a little desert scene might be fun. We're taking a call. Enjoy 25. Yeah, I had a feeling that you knew. More tubies and bits? Or more landscapies? I think landscapey? Did someone say desert? Please. I love Joshua Tree. Hey, Violet. I do too. The intention, something from the reception. Yeah. Oh, okay, transit. That does not sound fun. I'm good, baby goose as well. So playful and happy today. She's not crabby. She has the little hiccups. Finished sewing her curtains. Yeah. Okay, well, this sounds good. This sounds promising. Need to go to the Desert Botanical Garden and do it. Oh. Bought a membership, haven't gone back. Mayhem, go back. Go back, what are you doing? Also, I love this song. It's Wilco, Jesus, etc. Great tune. Fucking tune. Like that shrimp reminds me of my posture. This little fella. If I had a nickel for every baby goose talked about on Twitch, yeah. I'm gonna throw poo at you? What? Well, look. Based on what I'm sniffing right now, that might be an improvement. Is it cat or is... I can't. Hi, poo. Welcome in. Consider yourself respectfully threatened, Mayhem. Please consider yourself respectfully threatened. Back at it. What's the cosplay? CTD! How you doing? Yeah. Oh.